Good afternoon. As everyone is entering the webinar, we'll wait here for about another minute for everyone to get in, and then we'll get started. For those of you that are in, if you want in the chat, just put a quick note and tell us where you are, where you're from. Always fun to kind of see how broad the audience is here at the FTE office. Wow, everywhere. Well, for that individual who I saw was from LA, I certainly hope that everything is okay for you and that you're hanging in there. All right, why don't we get started here? Just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Ted Tucker. I'm the executive director here at the Foundation for Teaching Economics. And it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Ann Bradley. She is the George and Sally Meyer, Fellow in Economic Education, as well as the Vice President of Academic Affairs at the Fund for American Studies. In addition, she is a visiting professor at George Mason University. Her academic work ranges from income equality to economic freedom to the political economy of terrorism, which, of course, is what we're all here to hear about. Based on her research, she worked as an analyst for the CIA Office of Terrorism Analysis. Is that right, Anne? Did I get that
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
And it's really excited to have her here and that she's made time to talk with everybody. So, without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Professor Bradley.
Thank you, Ted. It is a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and we have about an hour, so I'm going to kind of give you an overview of, just exactly what Ted said, the political economy of terrorism. I've been interested in this topic for about a little over 20 years, and kind of the way I got involved in it and interested in it. As an economist, I was a PhD student at George Mason University when 9/11 happened. I was at the beginning of my second year. Uh, and my professor, who ended up being the chair of my committee, asked me right after, I mean, not right after, a couple of weeks after 9/11, asked if I was interested in writing a paper on the economics of terrorism. And he believed very strongly at the time that, there would be a lot of meetings, there would be a lot of policy that would come out of Capitol Hill, and nobody was going to call an economist and try to kind of get their input on how do we think about appropriate policy. How do we think about this new problem, which in some ways terrorism is not a new problem at all, but certainly 9/11 and al-Qaeda, they were innovators in kind of the way they executed terrorist attacks. And so I said, sure, I'd love to write this paper with you. Of course, being a graduate student, anytime anybody offers you a paper that you think will get published, you say yes. So I did, and kind of the rest is history. So I ended up doing my dissertation on this topic, went to work for the CIA for a little bit. I always really wanted to be in the classroom, and so I ultimately left the agency to go back to the classroom, which is what I'm doing now. Two co-authors and I have published a monograph on the political economy of terrorism, counterterrorism, and the war on terror that came out about a year ago. So it's still an active research project for me. But what I really get excited about is that I think, sorry, I'm just having a computer issue. Let me just make sure I can advance my slides here. Sorry. Okay. What I think is really important about this is certainly just as a matter of policy, terrorism is important. I think really in the last 2 decades in the war on terror, we've seen a lot. We've tried a lot of things from a policy perspective, and we really just in some ways have not moved the needle that much. And so this is kind of where economists come in and we say, well, we need to make sure that we're doing a few things when we address any any matter of policy. Certainly, if we're going to try to change the outcome of something, whether, in this case, we want less terrorism, but there's other kind of social outcomes that we might say we want more of this, like we want more people eating healthier, we want more people exercising. And so there's all sorts of outcomes that we can identify from a policy perspective. And I really think we need the economic way of thinking to guide us in terms of what is actually going to get the results that we want. But a deeper question is, can we get the results that we want? And so that's where I'm going to start with some just kind of fundamental, basic economic insights that I think are really important. And we should use these relentlessly, consistently, and we can really apply these insights to any matter of policy. And so when we think about economics, we talk about the word catalaxy or catalactics. This is the process of market exchange. And in that, we're really kind of talking about a praxeological theory, which is the theory of choice. That's just what that means. It means that economics are always studying human beings. They are our subject matter. And so we want to understand the choices that they make. And when we do that, we have to kind of list out the assumptions that we have, test those assumptions, make sure they're accurate. Because if our assumptions about human beings or the world are wrong, then certainly the things that we try to do to change incentives or change behavior are not going to get us the outcomes that we want. So kind of part of this praxeological understanding of economics is that human beings, again, are the center. And we are assuming that human beings engage in purposeful human action. This really is developed beautifully by Ludwig von Mises, an economist in the Austrian School of Economics. He wrote an enormous book. It's about 1,000 pages called Human Action. And actually the first third of that entire book, before he gets into what we would consider, kind of common sense economics maybe, is he talks about human nature. He talks about why do people make choices? How do they make those choices? And so this is really the starting point. Why would we need to do this for terrorism? Well, I'm going to make the argument that we always need to do this, no matter the issue at hand. But, I think, especially right after 9/11, but I think you still see it today, the rhetoric around terrorists is that we almost assume that they're not human, right? That they're kind of a special category of people. They're different. And of course, in some ways they are, but they still, they have human reason. They have human nature in the way that everybody else does. And so it's really important not to lose sight of that, because we're going to, and in this case, in the case of the war on terror, we've spent an enormous amount of money, a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of human capital dedicated to trying to stop terrorism. And like I said, I'm going to show you some data. We haven't moved the needle in, I think, ways that we want to move the needle. So an economist would come and say, that doesn't mean we don't do anything. We don't just pack up our bags and go home, but we certainly have to think about better ways to do this. And so when we're looking at kind of the human action model, we look at people that are trying to reconcile means and ends all the time. So terrorists have goals just like everybody else. And we need to try to understand what motivates them to engage in this horrific behavior that is not just personally destructive for them, but it's socially destructive. And of course, the response to terrorism is very expensive in a variety of ways and kind of harms human flourishing. Of course, that kind of goes without saying. So one of the assumptions that I thought was really important to kind of just detail a little bit is that terrorists are rational actors in the way that we assume as economists everybody else is a rational actor. What does that mean? It doesn't mean when we say people are rational, we are not saying they're always fully informed. They kind of clearly understand all the potential risks, all the potential rewards, all the potential costs and benefits. They've calculated all the sunk costs, all the opportunity costs. Of course, we're not robotic kind of homo economicus. We're not making that argument. It's a simpler and more fundamental argument, which is that people are trying to maximize their utility, right? They're trying to maximize their benefits, their personal benefits, and they're walking around doing this all the time. And you can just think about examples in your own life of, I always use the example with my students, like we do this every day, right? Many, many times a day. When you think about what you're going to eat for breakfast, you could have, kind of healthy avocado toast and black coffee, or you could have, kind of half a dozen donuts. And the half a dozen donuts might seem like a good idea, and you might choose it anyway, even though kind of in the long run, this is a bad idea, right? So we're assuming that type of behavior. We're also assuming that people are always trying to minimize the costs that they face. And we're always assuming that people are self-interested. Self-interest includes the notion of sacrifice. So kind of point number three here is what I like to say is, do terrorists love their mothers? Probably, right? So in this sense, what I mean, and I'm not trying to be trite at all, but in some ways, this is just very kind of common sense stuff, but I think we lose sight of it because when we look at the activities, the actions of terrorists, it's frightening, it's vile, it's reprehensible, and we want to live in a world free from terrorism. And that's certainly a good goal, but we can't forget the basics, right? So terrorists also engage in other regarding behavior. They pursue their own self-interest, but they also care about their families. They want to have friends. They're human beings. And when we look at the organization of al-Qaeda, which is what I'm going to spend some time on tonight, we see that the al-Qaeda leadership was very aware of these problems. And so they designed an organization to try to tackle those problems, right? And so they were trying to create brotherhood. They were trying to create a sense of purpose, all sorts of things that they were doing because they realized these truths. And I think the other thing that's important to recognize here is that terrorists don't just walk around living their lives with their only goal being, kind of terrorism and defeating the United States or destroying capitalism or annihilating human freedom, that they have individual goals, right? And so the terrorist organization has to recognize that people have those own self-interested individual goals. And then the terrorist organization has to get individual goals aligned with the organizational goals. And we see, of course, this is true all the time. If you have a job, your employer wants you to care about your job and about the company and about the work you do. And so they have to align your own self-interest with the interests of the organization. So there's just a lot of literature in economics on the theory of the firm, the theory of employment contracts, labor economics, all sorts of things where we study this. So I wanted to just take all those basics and apply it to the problem of terrorism. So kind of just a few things right out of the gate that I think are important. Again, assumptions I'm making as an economist. Terrorism is an emergent order. What that means is that nobody kind of invented terrorism one day, right? It evolves. Terrorists across the world and across human history use similar tactics. They might have similar broad goals like political control, legal control, cultural, religious, all those types of things. But their specific goals tend to be very focused on where they live, and the conditions in which they live, both economic, political, legal, and religious, etc. So terrorism is something that emerges and evolves and changes over time, which means we can get more terrorism over time, or we can get less terrorism over time. Very significant U.S. policy goal, of course, is to try to rid the world of terrorism. I'm going to make an argument that you can't do that. You can't ever get zero. And I think it takes a basic economic understanding, just again, taking some of the micro 101 ideas that we learn in the first couple weeks of that type of class and applying them to this issue, which again, I think a lot of people don't think about economics when they think about terrorism. So I wanted to bridge those gaps. So I think that there's an upward sloping supply curve for terrorism. I think there's a downward sloping demand curve. This is not the same. Terrorism doesn't operate like the market for pizza. Pizza, when we look at the, kind of sales of pizza across the United States, it's very observable, right? We can understand how many cheese pizzas are bought, how many pepperoni pizzas are bought. We can understand how weather impacts this kind of purchase. People probably buy more pizza on the weekend than they do during the week. So we just have a lot of data because this is happening in a routine, regular commercial market. Terrorism is obviously very different. There's no terrorism store where somebody kind of says, I want you to do this or I want you to do that. Terrorism often operates more like a nonprofit organization. And in that, the terrorists have to raise money. They have goals. They have objectives they want to meet. They have to keep their donors happy. They also have all sorts of employment contracts and issues that they have to deal with. So part of what I wanted to try to think about was, who are the people that demand terrorism? Again, in the market for pizza, we can identify who the demanders are pretty easily. They're the people who buy pizza. I think the people who demand terrorism are harder to pinpoint. And this is really what I wanted to focus on when I was an economic analyst at the agency. And the reason for that is because I was working in terror finance. And so one of the things we do when we work on terror finance from an intelligence perspective is we are trying to figure out the assets that terrorists have. We also want to know where they get those assets, and we want to know what those assets are going to be directed towards. So they're stockpiling money, they're stockpiling weapons, they're stockpiling all sorts of things. Maybe they're buying real estate. We want to know. And of course, intelligence, the hard part of intelligence is you don't know, and they're doing it. And so we have to try to figure that out. So I think the demanders are the people that might not ever pay for it outright, but they're happy. They think that terrorism is going to satisfy some social, political, or economic goal. There are other people that might be more obvious demanders of terrorism. And then there's the suppliers of terrorism, right? The suppliers of terrorism are the people that are actually producing terrorist attacks. They're organizing terrorist organizations. So in this, like I said, I'm going to talk a bit about al-Qaeda tonight. They're a supplier of terrorism. Can you be both a supplier and a demander? You can, right? In the sense that you could be a recruit that's working in the marketing department of al-Qaeda, which they had. By the way, anything I'm talking about tonight is unclassified, so you can access all this in an open source fashion. These are people that are supplying terrorism, but they also can sit back and say, I'm a cheerleader for this. I support the cause. I want this to happen. I want this to succeed. And so when we're engaging in terror finance and at the level of intelligence, what are we trying to figure out? It's much easier in some ways to figure out who the suppliers of terrorism are because we can identify them. And even if we can't ever really fully flesh out the demand curve, this theoretical model helps us think about the different sides of this issue. Because remember that economics is about incentives. Incentives matter for human behavior. If we want less terrorism, we need different incentives that terrorists face. Now, I think the unfortunate thing that I will say early on in this kind of talk tonight is that it's very hard for US policy to make terrorism go away. And let me just go back to the demand and supply curve, right? One last thing I want to say on this is that, and this is an immutable law of economics. A good friend who's passed away now, economist named Steve Horowitz, used to talk about it this way. He used to always say, supply is demand in disguise. And what he meant by that, and this is true, is that supply only exists in a market to satisfy demand, right? So this is why we see sometimes businesses fail. They fail for a lot of reasons. Maybe people just don't want what they're selling, or they used to want it and they don't anymore, or maybe it's a production issue or a pricing issue or a marketing issue. There could be many issues, right? But supply exists. Entrepreneurs make big investments because they think people want it. I think we should want the good or service. I think we should apply our thinking of terrorism in the same way. We should say there's a supply of terrorism, but that is dependent to some extent on the demand. So if over time people stop demanding terrorism or demand it less, what are you going to see? You're going to see a reduction or a leftward shift in the demand curve. And that's going to change the investment that terrorists are going to make. So I don't think it's plausible or realistic to say that we could ever have a world with zero terrorism in the same way you can't have a world with zero crime, et cetera, right? But you can talk realistically about a world where we have less terrorism than we do now. And that's a matter both of thinking economically about it and then devising policy that's directed at those actors, both suppliers and demanders, to the extent that we can articulate who they are, and then think about what policy moves could we make, or military moves, or intelligence moves, or diplomatic moves. It's about all forms of statecraft, I would say, not just policy, could possibly and productively change those incentives. So I'll talk a little bit about that. What are some of the problems here? Well, just one big problem, even within the United States set of government agencies, is that we don't have one working definition of terrorism. So the Department of Defense has one, the U.S. Army manual has one, Federal Criminal Code has one, Patriot Act has one. And so this is a little bit difficult. And one of the problems that we've seen in the war on terrorism is that these agencies all have their own skin in the game. And because they have their own mission and their own directives, they often don't collaborate and communicate and cooperate with each other in kind of the ideal way that we would want them to. So that's kind of more of a bureaucratic problem, which is maybe a separate matter of discussion. But I still think it's relevant. The UN today still does not have a definition for terrorism. So in some cases, it's just some organizations are unable to say that they can kind of agree on what a definition is. So when we were doing our research for our monograph, this, takes months to figure out, well, what definition do we think is most appropriate? There's all these definitions out there. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the key elements here that we thought were really important. Obviously, the use of violence, mass destruction. So this includes killing people, destroying real estate, destroying infrastructure, destroying key government buildings or key commercial buildings. And you saw this on 9/11, of course, but it's not unique to 9/11. Another key important element of terrorism for our purposes is that we're dealing with non-combatant targets. So these are not opposing sides in a war or a coup, but rather terrorists specifically target non-combatant targets because that helps them do exactly what their name says, which is create panic and terror and fear. The more afraid we are of the terrorist, the more they have a grip in some sense. And so there's some interesting work on, how we can not be as afraid and really understand the risks. That separate matter as well. And then they're doing this for a reason, right? Purposeful human action. They are not doing it because they're bored and they watch too many video games. That is not the explanation. The explanation is that they believe, especially the leadership of the organization, they've designed this organization for certain ends. And when you start to look at different terrorist organizations around the world, they are very explicit in many cases about what they want, what they dislike, and what they're aiming for. Al-Qaeda is no exception. So they broadly want to induce some social change. And for our purposes, we were really interested in looking at organic terrorist organizations that were not sponsored by a state. State-sponsored terrorism matters. It's important. I think it deserves a separate category of analysis. And the reason is because they don't really have to fundraise. They don't have to think about the demand and supply conditions in the same way that a kind of organic terrorist organization would. So our focus was really on these kind of organic groups. So I want to spend a little time talking about al-Qaeda, a little bit of time talking about what they did and what our response has been, and then open it up for questions. So really, al-Qaeda goes way back. And of course, as you probably know, Osama bin Laden was the originator. He was the kind of CEO, if you will, very much cult of personality within the organization. And this goes way back to the Soviet Afghanistan of invasion in 1979. So Osama bin Laden puts his boots on and starts to fight the Soviets. So this is also important to understand what motivates bin Laden and the three that formed al-Qaeda. They are not Marxists. They are not communists. They actually fought against the communists. They have kind of different ideological perspectives. And in that time, when the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the kind of the spread of the Soviet Empire, under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, Operation Cyclone was initiated. The reason I have a picture of the Guinness World Records here is it still holds, the Operation Cyclone holds the Guinness World Record for the longest and most expensive covert program. So this is a covert supply of, it started out as being kind of medical supplies. It started out in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it grew over time. It was adopted as well by the Reagan administration. So and it extended beyond 1989 after the Soviets left. So it was a very extensive covert program to help the Mujahideen as they fought the Soviet Empire. And in the United States, CIA and other intelligence organizations funded the Mujahideen and worked with Pakistan's intelligence agency to support this effort. So here you see a picture of Ronald Reagan So again, this is after Carter leaves office. Ronald Reagan is meeting with some of the people who were involved in Operation Cyclone. That's what that's a picture of. Here we have the three leaders of Al-Qaeda, the original leaders. So you have Osama bin Laden, Abdullah Yusuf Azam, and Ayman al-Zawahiri. If you look here, so Al-Qaeda was formally founded in 1988. Bin Laden lives in in Saudi Arabia, which is where he's from. He has a very interesting history in all of this. I'll talk about that in a moment. And here in the center, you see a picture of Bin Laden, and he is meeting with a Pakistani journalist. And behind them on the wall is some sort of gun that was taken from one of the Russian soldiers. So bin Laden, one thing we know, I mentioned he was charismatic, very much a cult of personality. I think this was immensely, just absolutely necessary for him to be able to pull off what he did. And he loved to talk about what he thought, which from a post hoc intelligence perspective gives us a lot of information. Of course, kind of we didn't have it all in real time, but bin Laden is showcasing this gun, right? We kicked the Soviets out. We were victorious. And he loved to give interviews and all sorts of things. So he's doing this the entire time he's running Al-Qaeda. He issues many fatwas. He gives many speeches and declarations, and he likes to talk to the media. There's a media arm of Al-Qaeda as they grow over time into the 90s. One of the things I thought was really important to try to understand is, what does Al-Qaeda want? How do they get people to help them execute those goals? And why did Al-Qaeda have to kind of veer off what I believe was their desired path? Again, everything I'm telling you is unclassified, so someone somewhere knows a lot more than I do about this that has access to classified information. But here's a picture we can kind of put together. On the bottom of this graph or slide here, you see this is Al-Qaeda's flag. So like any other organization, the terrorist organization has to go through two great lengths to recruit people, to recruit money, to establish dominance, to establish authenticity and integrity as an organization. So they have a flag, again, marketing collateral, speeches, all sorts of things. One thing, as I mentioned, I wanted to understand, bin Laden was a Saudi-born son of a billionaire. It seems like you could make an argument that would be very easy for him to stay in Saudi Arabia. He was loyal initially to the Saudi government. That changes over time. In fact, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, bin Laden agreed to send basically a group of his kind of al-Qaeda mercenaries to go help. He offered that to the Saudi government, and the Saudi government turned him down and relied on troops from the United States. And so I think this is where the relationship, the loyalty to his home country starts to fracture. And if you listen to a lot of what he talks about and kind of the declarations of his organization, he is very upset about Western influence in the world generally and Western culture, capitalism. He talks about all of that stuff. He talks very specifically about the westernization of the Saudi government. He does not like American involvement in Middle Eastern politics, in Middle Eastern kind of oil politics. And he views the Saudi government as becoming westernized. And so he's upset about this. So there's a theoretical argument that would have been easier, lower cost for him to stay. But what does he do? He actually leaves. So the title I have at the top here is based on a theory from political science, Mansur Olson. He talks about the distinction between a roving bandit and a stationary bandit. A stationary bandit is kind of a group of thugs, you might think of it that way, that wants territorial dominance. They want to be a government. They want to control an area. A stationary bandit stays there, right? They pillage, they extract resources, they use a lot of violence, but they're not roaming, they're staying. So there's costs and benefits around that, which is kind of Mansur Olson's theory. And he contrasts that to the roving bandit. The roving bandit is the group of thugs that kind of rove around from place to place. They extract resources, still use violence, but they don't ever kind of put roots in the ground. And so there's costs and benefits around that. My argument here is that I think Al-Qaeda under bin Laden's leadership always wanted to be a stationary bandit and stay in Saudi Arabia. But in the early 90s, the Saudi government, under influence from the United States, kicks bin Laden and al-Qaeda out of Saudi Arabia and they go to Sudan. They stay in Sudan for several years. They are kicked out of Sudan under US influence and pressure, and they ultimately settle down in Afghanistan, where they make a relationship that still exists today with the Taliban. So I can talk about more about that later. I'm working on another paper on that right now. So let's fast forward to the 9/11 attacks, because of course this is what initiates the enormous response, both militarily, economically, politically, from the United States and allies in what we now refer to as the War on Terror. So the 9/11 attacks, we're all probably really familiar with them. This is KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. If you go, you can get this available online in PDF form, the 9/11 Commission report. Very fascinating. I found it very useful when I was doing my research in the midst of all this. So when I started writing about this, it's maybe 2003. We don't have any of the knowledge that we have today in some ways, and we certainly didn't have the academic work on it. Today, I did a literature review, and there's about 10,000 articles somewhere around there that have been published on the topic of terrorism since 9/11. So we had almost nothing prior to that. So I used the 9/11 Commission report, and what I learned from that is that the planned 9/11 attack was intended to be much bigger. In fact, KSM pitches 9/11 years before it happens to bin Laden. He's turned down. In the 90s, what do we see al-Qaeda doing? They're attacking. They attack the USS Cole. They attack the World Trade Center. They bomb embassies. They bomb hotels. What are they doing? They're learning. They're cultivating their skills. They're training. So all this builds up ultimately to 9/11. But 9/11 wasn't a well-crafted goal in 1989. KSM goes back to bin Laden and says, I have a better idea. Let's do it this way. And ultimately, his goal was much bigger than what actually happened, which is a terrifying thing to consider. So what KSM proposed is that there's kind of a, if this is a word, bi-coastal attacks on the west coast of the United States, on the east coast of the United States simultaneously, which would have invoked more fear, more terror. And again, that's the goal, right? The goal is we're going to kill people and destroy things, destroy your institutions, make you afraid of us so that you will do what we want. Now, we can have a debate about whether the United States would have ever come to the table. So bin Laden, again, he's doing cost-benefit analysis in his own head and leading his organization accordingly. That doesn't mean he's right. And that doesn't mean he's kind of doing the right calculations, but he's engaging in purposeful, human action and organizing a bunch of people and resources around it. So in economics, we talk about constrained optimization all the time, right? We have to think about the constraints and optimize around them. And so KSM's bi-coastal kind of attack was turned down. And the reason it was turned down is really important. It was turned down because it was just more risky. And for bin Laden and al-Qaeda to fail on 9/11 means not only are many people in their organization die, which happened anyway, but they're probably caught, potentially. But, more importantly, we're not afraid of them. So we're not really afraid in the same way of terrorists who are kind of, inept, right? They strap some homemade thing on them and then they just get arrested. They walk in front. I live in Washington or near Washington, D.C., and you hear reports of this occasionally, right? Somebody just tries to do something, it doesn't work, and they end up in jail. Like, this is the kind of worst outcome for a terrorist organization. So, and as we know, 9/11 wasn't even executed perfectly based on what bin Laden ordered KSM or allowed him to do. The other thing we really learn, I think, that's important when we read the 9/11 Commission report is that what they were worried about was that the hijackers and the terrorist recruits would abort the mission. And you look at the instructions that they were given when they came into Florida. They were told to blend in. They were told to get jobs and get gym memberships, have a beer after work, get a girlfriend, right? Blend in. Like anybody coming to the United States would say, this is an amazing place. I'm going to go to the gym. I love the grocery store. I'm going to get a girlfriend. I'm going to have a beer after work, all these things. So they wanted them to do that because that kept their cover intact. The problem, though, is that life is pretty good when you're doing that, right? It's like I have autonomy. I can drink a beer when I want. I can go out with a girl. I don't need anybody's permission. And so the threat of defection was very high in the time from when the hijackers were in the United States. And so there's a lot of instructions given to them to maintain because they knew the threat for any given hijacker could kind of unravel the entire plan. And even in spite of that not happening, we see the Pentagon and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the field where the plane crashed, because US citizens took down that plane. That was not part of their plan. So even from their long kind of decades planning, they didn't really get what they wanted, nor did they satisfy fully their donors. So this kind of Arabic script that you see here, this was obtained by US forces in a raid in Syria in 2003, I believe. It's called the Golden Chain. Everything that would be interesting to know about this is classified. There's literally 2 articles on the internet that you can find in terms of open source about what this is. But basically what we know is that these are names that were written on a piece of paper, and they were early funders of al-Qaeda. So bin Laden, to do all of this on 9/11, not only had to organize a lot of people around his mission and cause, but he had to organize money. When I tell you how much it cost to execute 9/11, you'll probably be surprised. We meaning the intelligence community, believes that it cost around $500,000 to execute what happened on September 11th, 2001, which is really not a lot of money. And in some ways, that's terrifying, right? Because there have been terrorist groups that have had upwards of $1 billion, including ISIS at one time, including al-Qaeda having a great deal more money than they do now, and certainly than they did at this time. So it's not a money problem. It's a coordination problem, which in some ways is much more difficult. What that means is that I think the threat of another 9/11 is low. I think we have to have reasonable caution and fear about what is possible. It's certainly not impossible for it to happen again. But the fact that they were as successful as they were is significant, and of course unleashed the war on terror. Back in the early days of al-Qaeda, it operated very much as a paramilitary bureau. This is kind of my language around it. It operates similar to the way a military would operate. There's ranks, there's hierarchy, and the center of the organization, those top 3 leaders, are in charge. Information is given and orders are given to them. Information flows back to them, but is not a democracy. They're not meeting around a conference table, getting, kind of having a vision board for what the future will look like. It is not a democratic type of organization. So it's very much, and it's a cell organization, which is kind of what this slide is trying to capture, which is that you have a religious department, you have a communications department. The hijackers were even broken down into different specialties. You had pilots, you had kind of the muscle men, right, who were to take over the plane. So they were very they were dividing the labor and specializing, right? They were trying to figure out, how are we going to train people in a very specialized fashion so that we can get them to do what we need them to do. And that's the only way to be successful. With the death of bin Laden, al-Qaeda has very much changed. It's not the same organization that it was in the 80s. That's a big loss if you're in al-Qaeda. I think that's a win for everybody else. Al-Qaeda is much more like an umbrella franchise organization. There's at least 20 potential active groups that claim the name al-Qaeda, but these are completely separate. They may or may not work together. They're much more likely to work with other terrorist groups. So what we know right now is that al-Qaeda is very active in Afghanistan, and they are active in cooperating with the Taliban, especially in light of recent current events. And so terrorist groups may get along with one another. They may actually just kind of tolerate one another, or in some cases, they may fight with one another. And so when terrorist groups are fighting each other, that's a big problem regionally for them. And so I think a world where terrorist groups are collaborating, including, is a world that is much more threatening for the rest of us than when they're infighting. All right, so the war on terror is the policy and military otherwise response. Um, if you look at this, it's fascinating. This is a global terrorism database. This is all available online, and it's a great database that you can get a ton of information from. If you look, really, it's really interesting, not in a good way, I say that word, because after 2000, of course, 9/11 is picking up a lot of the deaths and fatalities and non-fatal injuries from terrorism. But if you look at the overall slope of the graph, it peaks actually around 2015. Then you have a really big frontal assault on ISIS, which results in kind of the decline of terrorism. But the bigger point I think to get from this, if you look at the left-hand graph portion of the graph, is you see that there was more terrorism after 9/11, and we can make some arguments as a result of our policy response than there was before. So certainly, economists have to think about unintended consequences. We don't want to engage in different types of strategies that are actually going to exacerbate the problem of terrorism. And I think a lot of what we see is that terrorism is worse in other parts of the world. We haven't had another 9/11 in the United States, and that's an important and good thing. But we have a lot of terrorism in other parts of the world that we did not have to worry about before. Boko Haram in Nigeria is an important example. So how can we think more like economists to kind of try to be better at addressing this issue? And I'm going to kind of stop after that so I can take questions. Again, just using some micro here, I think that there's different ways we can think about the way that terrorists are going to respond to our actions. Because there's always going to be a response because we're dealing with human beings, right? They're not just going to stop. And so there's income-based policies, price-based policies, and I think most importantly, opportunity cost-based policies. So what is an income-based policy? Well, one thing we could do, and again, I worked in terror finance, we were trying to intercept terrorist resources. We were trying to abscond them. In fact, we worked with the Treasury Department, and we would try to make a case if this thing, like maybe it's a fake NGO or a shell corporation, we think it's a terrorist organization, we have enough evidence, we would go to the Treasury Department and ask them to be declared a terrorist organization, and internationally their assets would be frozen. This is not going to reduce the demand for terrorism. That's an important thing to keep in mind. It is going to make it harder for terrorists to move money around. So it's not that we shouldn't do that, but it's more going to affect the supply of terrorism than it is going to affect the demand. So I'm making an argument you need to do both, but we really have to focus on the demand curve shifting to the left if we want to think about less terrorism over time. Second idea here is a price-based policy. So things that we can do to make it more expensive for terrorists to operate. We can have metal detectors in airports. We can harden targets. We did a lot of this after 9/11. I think it was really important. Thinking things like making it impossible to get into the cockpit while you're in flight. That stuff is really important. I think the most important is opportunity cost-based policies. So these are going to make it that the things that terrorists could do besides engage in terrorism become much more attractive. And so one of the arguments that, again, I think is just kind of common sense in some way, but we leave it off the table, is that economic development, perhaps fueled by some humanitarian aid, but thinking about how you get productive, robust economic institutions in some of these countries. If you look at the countries that are the worst for terrorism, I think I have a graph for this. I have so much material, sorry. If you look at, these are the countries where terrorism is the biggest problem. If you reconcile that with their economic freedom scores, they're some of the worst countries in the world in terms of not having functioning markets, not having legitimate governments that are democratic, not having the rule of law, and not having kind of the freedoms that we think are so important: freedom of association, freedom of religion, etc. And so some of the places today where terrorism is a safe place or a haven for terrorism, places like Afghanistan, Syria, Pakistan, etc. These are places that either have really no economic development, have had eroded economic development, or maybe are in a transition period. And so I think that we have to play the long game and the short game. I guess that's one of the things I would say here to wrap up. I think we have been hyper-focused on stopping the terrorists in their tracks. I think you have to do that. You have to, for example, like I said, make the ports safer, make the airplanes safer, make it hard for people to get on airplanes with guns and weapons. That is a no-brainer. But what we need to keep in mind is that is not reducing the demand for terrorism. So the people that are in Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, Nigeria, who wake up in the morning and say, that being a terrorist is the way I'm going to get freedom or get what I want or get the religion I want or whatever, political control. Us hardening targets isn't going to change that. So we have to harden the targets, raise the prices for the terrorists, but we also have to think about changing their opportunity costs. I think what's frustrating and difficult about this is that this is not something that US policy alone can do. A lot of the problems in these countries are endogenous to that country. So the United States can't go to Afghanistan and say, be a democracy, have a market economy, we'll teach you how to do it, and then you'll have no problems. That is an organic problem. It's an institutional problem, and that has to happen in these countries. Now, are there things we can do to help it along? I think there are. So, Ted, it's 7:47 by my watch. I'm going to stop if that's okay, and you can tell me how you want me to field questions.
Sure. Um, what we'll do is we're going to use the Q&A feature. So those in the audience who would like to ask questions, just use the Q&A feature. Put your questions in it. You can also upvote questions that you see that you might like. And so I'll start. And let me ask you a question here.
Please.
So we have a question here from John Buck, who's asking, do the opportunity costs vary from country to country?
I think that not only that do they vary from country to country, but they vary from person to person. And so opportunity cost is a very specific to you kind of question. Now, I do think that it's going to, in some categorical way, change country to country, right? So why do you see it's not that we have zero terrorism in the developed world. Of course we do. And this is in some cases in Europe, for example, a growing problem. So we have issues we have to deal with. It's not that if you have economic freedom, you're safe. But I think the opportunity cost of being a terrorist is high in the United States relative to Afghanistan. I mean, you could make an argument, in fact, that in Afghanistan, the way to have the kind of best life is to be a supporting member of the Taliban. That's how you're going to get the most benefits. That's how you're going to get the most privileges. So I do think we can categorically look at different country rankings and say opportunity costs are clearly different across countries. But ultimately, that's an individual topic. But I think the answer is yes. And so we should respond accordingly, right? How we fight terrorism in the short run might always be the same from a military and intelligence perspective, but how we fight terrorism in the long run is going to be based on how do we think about shifting opportunity costs in different places and knowing that this is something that I think is outside of policy, US policy to some extent. I mean, again, if we could just make the world safe and free, we would have already done that. That's very hard to do, maybe impossible. So we have to look at things on the margin we can do.
Great. Thanks, Anne. This is a question from Chris Leonard, and definitely a question driven by his own personal experience, I think. But he's asking, how do you differentiate the economics of an organized group like al-Qaeda compared to a solo terrorist like the one in New Orleans a couple weeks ago?
Yeah. So in the literature, I mean, we adopt this, meaning me and my co-authors, but in the literature, there is a lot of attention paid to this question of the lone wolf is what we call, kind of the single individual that makes a decision to engage in some act of terrorism versus the organized group. I think, the lone wolf can do damage, certainly, especially if they don't get caught or killed, which are always big question marks, right? And it depends, getting caught and killing yourself. I mean, if you're a suicide bomber, then that's your intent. Some terrorists do not intend to be suicide bombers and are, right? So it's a mishap. And so I think that's how we try to distinguish, right? Just in terms of thinking about what does the lone wolf doing? What is the organization doing? I think in some ways, organizations are maybe easier to study because they have to do all the things that I mentioned al-Qaeda was doing. They need a brand. They need a marketing committee. They actually have they have mission statements. Al-Qaeda had a committee on religious philosophy because while religion is very important to what al-Qaeda, at least the top three, care about, um, it's not just that easy to get somebody to kill themselves in the name of religion. There's a lot of religious people around the world, and most of them don't die for that cause. And so there's something else at play. So the organization has to devote a lot of resources to tapping into that notion of the recruit and then making someone live their life by it. The lone wolf, they are much easier to study after the fact. Maybe that's kind of universally true, right? But the lone wolf doesn't get as far. I think on average, the lone wolf can't cause as much damage, right? When you have 10 hijackers that are dedicated to this mission, they can do more than one person can do. So if you look at the literature, there's a lot of distinction made, and then kind of what academics have tried to do, I think, is just say, okay, this is kind of some stuff that lone wolves do, and they're involved in soup to nuts in the terrorist action. They don't have an organization that they can rely on, whereas the organization is much more compartmentalized, using the division of labor, et cetera. So, do I think the world would be better if we didn't have any terrorist organizations and we just had kind of lone wolves running around? Probably. But the problem is that in some of these countries, it is rewarded. It is encouraged. Again, it is how you live a better life, is to be a member of one of these groups. And so we're not even close to being there yet. But I mean, that I think would be important to see these groups fade away over time.
We have Justin Steele is asking, how has social media aided terrorist groups? And it's a two-part question. And what can we do about that globally?
This is a tough question, right? Because we're talking about banning TikTok right now. So, I think that it's easy to say, oh, some social media is really destructive in a variety of ways. Can we ban it? I think that's actually hard to do and maybe not right. Terrorists are not the only people that use social media, of course, but that's not the question I think that was being asked. I think it's how do they use it? And so when you look back to the beginning of al-Qaeda, there was no social media. This guy just went on the radio basically and gave a, kind of 8,000 word talk about how he felt about everything that was, kind of his view of everything that was wrong in the world. And that was his way of doing several things. It was his way of evangelizing the people that were already on his side. It was the way of inspiring people who could help him, whether it was financially or with other types of resources or with safe haven, right? So governments and terrorists work together. So I think social media just makes this a lot easier. Certainly, if you look at ISIS, they video their horrific terrorist executions, and then they use those videos to go viral. Do they benefit from that? I think they do very much. And the problem is it's very low cost. It is very low cost to have social media accounts and to use social media to spread your material. So I think social media is just, it kind of does for terrorists what it does for everybody else, right? If you want to be an influencer, you can have a social media handle on Instagram, and, whether you're successful or not is a different matter, but it's democratic in the sense that anybody can do it. And so I think this gives terrorists an edge maybe in some ways, but I have to say for sure, I haven't been at the CIA in 20 years. So again, lots has changed, but I can guarantee you they have lots of people dedicated to hyper analyzing these social media accounts. So that's the downside for the terrorists. It's totally open, right? And so you don't want to reveal all your secrets and your whereabouts on your Instagram account. So I do think it creates benefits for them and it creates vulnerabilities for them. And so it's like with everything else, right? I think there's costs and there's benefits for the terrorist group. But do I think it's going to make terrorism more successful in the long run? No, because and here's why. I think terrorism ultimately comes down to the battle of ideas, the battle of, kind of fighting for human freedom, human dignity, egalitarian perceptions of dignity. And I think, when you look across most terrorist organizations, they stand diametrically opposed to those ideas. So they can talk about it all they want on social media. What they really have to do is persuade people. And so the question is like, outside of Afghanistan, how persuasive is the Taliban? It's not that persuasive to people who like freedom. It's actually, kind of runs against their purposes. So I think like with everything else, there's costs and benefits, but I do think it's a new tool that they absolutely use.
I have a question here from Varun Gupta. And he's just asking, still a bit confused about who are the demanders of terrorism. Could you
Yeah.
please clarify?
Sure. So think about if you are a demander for anything else, right? If you want to consume this product or you want to benefit from this product. The demanders of terrorism are the people, this is an analogy I like to give. Um, the people who write checks to al-Qaeda, that golden chain letter, right? The original donors, who are they? I think that they are people who are demanding terrorism, right? They are saying, I want your organization to exist. I like your goals. The suppliers are just the members of al-Qaeda. So the people that write them checks, that would be one example of somebody who's not only saying, I hope you succeed, but here's money. It could also be somebody that supports in a non-monetary way a terrorist group, training, religious education, again, running a social media. It could be lots of things like that. I think it's hard in some ways for us to conceptualize the people that are happy about it, but we never know who they are. So think about like if you like, this is a ridiculous analogy, but it's just one that I can think of since football season, right? So if you're sitting on your couch and you're rooting for your football team to win, that football team never knows that you're rooting for them, right? You are made happy when they win. They are made happy when they win. You demand that football team to be successful. There's some of that going on here too, right? Where this is what makes it very different from like, I buy a cheese pizza and we know that I'm a demander of cheese pizza because I have engaged in the transaction. This, because it's a not-for-profit type of organization, they're not selling their services per se, but they are being supported in a variety of ways. So the last one that I mentioned, the cheerleaders on the couch, we're never really going to tap into them, but I think they matter. And here's why. If those people go away, they don't follow them on Instagram or social media, for example. They don't lend some sort of vocal or other support, then I think terrorism starts to lessen over time because I very much believe that supply and demand move together. The reason I say we'll never get zero terrorism is because there will always be the person, the lone wolf. There will always be the person who you cannot convince, no matter how great of a life they have, how rich of a society they come from, whatever. They're going to do it and they're probably going to fail. We hope that they fail, right? You're always going to have some amount of terrorism that's not zero. But I don't think we have to have the amount that we have now. But part of that is our work on really trying to articulate who are the supporters of terrorism. So maybe we can replace the demand curve, because I think that's more abstract, with people who in a variety of ways support, are pleased by, are happy when they win. So that would be a way that I would try to kind of articulate that a little bit better.
Great. Thank you, Anne. We have just one last question and then we'll let you go. And certainly appreciate you taking the time out today
Pleasure.
to talk with our teachers. This is a question here from Ray Sanders. It's kind of a two-part question. As you mentioned, there likely are some ways we can help Afghanistan along the path toward more economic freedom. Isn't this what we unsuccessfully tried to do for 20 years? And then what types of things do you feel can we do going forward?
Okay, great question. I'm going to try to tackle the first one, Ted, and then if I forget the second one, you just remind me, okay? I actually don't think that's what we did the first time. I do not think that in our 20 years in Afghanistan, we were fighting for economic freedom. I think we gave lip service to economic freedom in some ways. If you, and there's it's like such a long answer to this, so I won't go into all of it, but one of the things I teach in my class is the Hayek-Friedman hypothesis, named after F.A. Hayek and Milton Friedman. And one thing that talks about their hypothesis is that it is impossible to have stable democracy unless you have a free market economic system first. That's a pretty radical hypothesis. It was radical in the 80s when they came up with it. I think it remains radical today. But I think if it's true, which I believe it has some credibility, it means that our foreign policy is a lot of times kind of working against itself, maybe. So I don't know that in Afghanistan, our first order of business was to create and help them develop free markets or develop economic freedom. I think our first purpose um, was we went in there after 9/11, and so we went there for one reason. I think we stayed for another reason. What I think we stayed to try to help establish democratic institutions, and this just didn't work. And the reason it didn't work, I would recommend a book to you by Chris Coyne. It's called After War. It is a great book. I ask all my students to read it. Well, depending on the class, but when we're talking about these issues, they read it. It's a great book. And he basically asked the economic question, can you engage in democratic nation building using military force? And then each chapter is a different case study. And he looks at a lot of data. We've tried to do this many times. We've tried to do it in Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. We were successful doing it in Japan and Germany. His argument is that there were very different conditions at the time and a willing population, but he argues that they had some of these institutions of commerce. Afghanistan doesn't. And so I think to ask Afghanistan to kind of embrace democracy is unfair in the sense that why would the Afghanis trust their government? They're run by, kind of a narco-terrorist organization, and they have been for a long time. So they don't even have a historical memory of like what it's like to trust your government. Democracy requires that we trust our government. So anyway, a little bit long-winded, but I think all these things very much work together and matter for our policy initiatives. So I think it's one thing to say we're going to stop the terrorists, we're going to hunt them down, we're going to detain them and kill them. Okay, great. That's important, right? But I think that's just one part of what we have to do. So how, and maybe this was part of the second question, what could we do going forward? This sounds utterly simplistic, and I don't think it is. I don't think it's going to solve all of our problems. But I think as much as possible, where we can, establishing commercial relationships with people and firms in other countries as much as we possibly can. Because if the Hayek-Friedman hypothesis is right, then it's trade and commerce that facilitates social trust, and social trust is what you need to trust your government and have a democracy. So I actually think trying to figure out how to trade with people, I'm not talking about opium traders and I'm not talking about the Taliban. I'm talking about in these parts of the world where there's little glimmers of commerce. Is there a way to support that? The answer is usually yes. And it doesn't have to be a complicated trade policy or pact. But what can we do to facilitate, to help? I think this is the avenue for the development of economic freedom. And I would say we need to do that. We didn't do it last time. I don't think in the way that we should have. And again, I think part of the problem was just a lot of different interagency conflict on the ground in Afghanistan, making it very hard for anybody to get done what they needed to do. One little anecdote, I've heard Chris Coyne give a talk on this book many times. I ask him to come speak in my class, and he usually will do that. And so one example he gives is he pulls out the Army Field Manual, and he says, so you're in Afghanistan, right? And you're a member of the Army. And in the Army Field Manual, it says part of your responsibility is to develop systems of banking and commerce, which should strike everyone as totally absurd. That is not the comparative advantage of the Army. They don't know how to do it. That's not even possible for one person or one organization. We can't go develop the institutions of banking and commerce in another country. So again, I think that's like a technocratic way to try to think you can solve the problem. And I think we need organic change in these countries. And that comes through commercial ties. And that goes all the way back to Smith, Adam Smith. So it's not the answer that everybody wants to hear, because I think that answer is tough, because there's not an obvious policy response, right? But I think it's doable. We've done it over time. And I would encourage us, yeah, we got to stop the bad guys, but that's not enough. How do we advance economic freedom as much as possible in the world? Because that's going to ultimately solve the longer term problem of terrorism and make that demand curve reduce. Hope I answered both questions, Ted. Sorry if I didn't.
Yeah, great. Well, there's plenty more, but I know it's after 5 o'clock. So thank you very much. We'll have to bring you back for a return engagement. I'm sure that, and then we can maybe just focus just on the questions.
Yeah, I would love that. And I'm just going to put my TFAS email here if anybody wants to email me with a question. I would be happy to talk offline if that's okay. If they want. If you don't, that's okay too.
Oh, absolutely fine, Ann. It's if you're willing, they're very curious teachers, very insightful questions. So, but thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank
Um,
you.
So, anyways, I don't have anything else. Again, everyone, thank you very much for attending and listening and asking those really good questions. I know, Lisa, do you have anything?
I do not. Thank you to all of you who attended, and of course to Anne. Debbie, I'm not sure if you have the evaluation link that you want to share now, or if that will be sent via email later.
I'll just send everybody the evaluation in the email.
Okay, great. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
All right. Good night, Ann. Take care.
Good night.